Now, West was over a luncheon there on the Wednesday beginning of the conference, the international conference. There would be 1,500 people at this luncheon. So he decided to give away big book study tapes as door prizes for the people. And he gave away 100 sets. Now, you have to know West, he was a cunning and baffling alcoholic. Now, he knew where everybody was sitting. He was over it, so he seized a guess. So he let people win these tapes. They thought they were winning them, but he decided who was going to win them. And people won them from every state and every community, and they took these tapes back all over the world. And this is really what started the great interest and got the message out to people of the Big Book Study. And Charles and I began to be invited to go different places and to start, what we're doing today through what Wesley was able to do. Each year, and it's like last year, we did a little more than we should have done. But we did about 35 Big Book Studies in most of the United States, in Australia and Canada and New Zealand. And it all began with, it's still the same way. We think we're sharing what we know and what we think is so vitally important to Alcoholics Anonymous, the message that lies within the Big Book. And so, there's nothing new about it, Charlie said. It's still the same. We think it's still the same as we were doing in hotel rooms. There's nothing fancy about this thing. And this weekend is going to be a weekend of sharing, our understanding, and the fellowship we're going to have here over the program in the Big Book, Alcoholics Anonymous.
And in the study of the Big Book, Alcoholics Anonymous, we almost have to go back to the beginning and talk just a little bit about some of the history behind the Big Book, talk a little bit about how it came into being, and talk a little bit about what the original purpose of the book actually is. And I know that if we would go back as far as 1937, in a little house on Ardmore Street in Akron, Ohio, there was two fellows sitting in the kitchen there drinking coffee. And one of them was named Bill Wilson, and the other one was named Bob Smith. Now, Bill had been sober since the fall of 1934, and Dr. Bob had been sober since June of 1935. Bill had originally visited with Dr. Bob. He was in Akron on a business trip. He almost got drunk himself. And he had remembered how back in New York City, even though he had never helped any other drunk, that every time he had tried to help one, he himself had been helped. He had always felt amazingly uplifted. And he had called on Dr. Bob in 1935. And in the calling on Dr. Bob, he brought to Dr. Bob some information that he had never heard before. He brought to Dr. Bob the idea of the disease concept of alcoholism. He told Dr. Bob about the fact that he himself had been in a hospital in New York City called the Towns Hospital. And there he had learned from a doctor named Dr. Silkworth some ideas about this thing called alcoholism. He explained to Dr. Bob the physical allergy of the body that ensures that when we alcoholics take a drink, it produces a physical craving and makes it virtually impossible for us to stop drinking, and we end up drunk and sick and in all kinds of trouble. And he said, now Bob, this was explained to me by Dr. Silkworth as being an allergy because it is an abnormal reaction to alcohol. Well, most people do not get that phenomenon of craving after they've had a drink or two. And he'd explained to Dr. Bob about this thing called the obsession of the mind. How that if you find something that feels good, and it seems to be the answer to a problem, your mind immediately becomes addicted to the idea of repeating success. And he explained to Dr. Bob that sometime during his life he hadn't felt good and he had taken a drink of alcohol and it made him feel better. And the mind immediately remembered that. And he said, Bob, every time after that when you didn't feel good, you would try a drink of alcohol and it always made you feel better. And he said, your mind became obsessed with the idea of drinking alcohol. And even though it eventually began to destroy you, and everybody around you told you you couldn't drink, and even though from time to time you knew you couldn't drink, your mind would still tell you that it's okay to take a drink. He said that obsession of the mind is so strong that it makes you believe a lie. It makes you believe something that isn't true. It makes you believe that this time it's going to be okay. This time 2 drinks and I'm not going to get drunk. And he said, Bob, people like us who have this physical allergy of the body and this obsession of the mind have become absolutely powerless over alcohol. And it has developed into a hopeless condition of the mind and of the body. And he said, unless something is done to relieve us of this condition, we either die or we go permanently insane, one of the two. And for the first time, Dr. Bob knew what his problem was. Like the rest of us, he had viewed it as a lack of willpower. He had viewed it as a lack of moral character. He had perhaps viewed it as sin. And why would we not? Everybody in the world told us that while we were drinking. And for the first time, Dr. Bob understood what the problem really is. They also discussed the solution to the problem as being a power greater than human power, God as we understand Him, or whatever you want to call Him, and finding of that power through what was referred to as a vital spiritual experience, during which old ideas were cast aside and replaced with a new set of ideas. And with a new set of the ideas, then the mind did not believe the lie any longer. They were restored to sanity, and they wouldn't have to drink if they could have this spiritual experience. They would find the power that would overcome the power of alcohol. They also discussed a little practical program of action that both of them had been trying to use in their life, Bill in New York City and Bob in Akron. And the little practical program of action had been given to them by a group of fundamentalist Christians called the Oxford Group. And Bill said to Bob, if we can practice this in our life, then we can find that vital spiritual experience. And we will find that power, and then we won't have to drink anymore. And then we won't die or go permanently insane from alcohol. Now, 2 men sat in the kitchen and discussed these things, and they were probably the first 2 people in the world to know those 3 things necessary to recover. What is the problem? What is the solution? And what is the practical program of action necessary to find the solution? Now, as far back as June 1935, those 2 had called on a 3rd person in a hospital in Akron named Bill Dotson, and they had carried to Bill Dotson the same 3 pieces of information. Bill Dotson got up from his bed in the hospital. He went home to apply the practical program of action in his life, and he had a spiritual experience, and lo and behold, he had recovered from the disease also. Now, from June of 1935 to the summer of 1937, the 3 people had worked diligently with other alcoholics in Akron, New York City, Cleveland, and 1 or 2 other places. And while sitting in that kitchen in 1937 drinking coffee, they counted the number of people that they knew that were staying sober on these 3 pieces of information. And to their amazement, they found that in 3 small groups, 1 in New York City, 1 in Akron, 1 in Cleveland, and various 1s or 2s around the country, there was approximately 40 people staying sober. And they were absolutely amazed by this. Probably for the first time they realized that they had stumbled onto some information that might bring recovery to literally thousands and thousands of people throughout the world. That might bring recovery to any alcoholic who seriously was seeking sobriety. And they were faced with a decision. And the decision they were faced with is, what are we going to do with this information? Are we going to keep it for ourselves? Are we going to share it with other people? And if we share it with other people, how can we best accomplish that? In that 2 years, they had found only these 40 people sober, and they realized how small a number that is compared to the millions of people throughout the world suffering from the disease. And they had to make a decision on how best to do this thing. Probably that summer was the first example of the group conscience really beginning to work in this strange fellowship of 40 people staying sober. Because I'm sure that Bill probably turned to Dr. Bob and said, Bob, what do you think we ought to do about this? And probably Dr. Bob said, Billy boy, it beats the hell out of me. But he said, I think it is a decision that is so important that it should be made by all of us, not just you and I. And they called a meeting in Akron, and there was 18 people at that meeting that night. And the gist of the meeting was not so much, will we carry this to other people or not, but the gist of the meeting was, how can we best carry it to other people? Because one of the tenets or action steps they had been working on was carrying the message to others. That had seemed to always be a great part of this. So the real purpose of the meeting was to decide, how can we best do it? Not are we going to do it, but how can we best do it? And that night they decided 3 things. They talked about, argued about, and ended up voting to do 3 things. The first thing they decided they were going to do was to build a chain of hospitals throughout the world so that every suffering alcoholic could find treatment in a hospital setting. And a hospital should be 4 stories. On 1 story we would have a unit to withdraw from alcohol and go into a treatment program of some kind. On another unit we would have a live-in workout arrangement. In another unit we may have a educational system set up. And in progressing through all 4 of the units, any alcoholic could recover from the disease. Part of the thing was going to be that they were going to retrain alcoholics so that they could find a job when they left the treatment center. And we always laugh about that because we don't know any alcoholics that need to be retrained. Now, most of us have already got 3 or 4 different occupations you damn near have to have if you're a practicing alcoholic. And the second thing they decided to do that night was to hire and train a group of missionaries and send them throughout the world to carry this great message of recovery wherever they found the alcoholic. And the third thing they decided to do was to write a book. They needed some money in order to build the hospitals and hire and train the missionaries. And they figured if we can write a book about our experiences, it will become an immediate bestseller and will make literally millions of dollars. And then this will finance the hospitals and the treatment centers and the missionaries. And the book was to be the collective knowledge, experience, and wisdom of these first 40 people. And hopefully the book would be able to carry the message of recovery in the written word or by the written word, the same as they had been carrying it by the spoken word, one-on-one to each other. In looking at the magnitude of the problem, in looking at the distances involved, in looking at the millions of people involved, they knew that they could never do it face-to-face, one-on-one. But that was real good where you could. But those people in Akron, New York City, and Cleveland most certainly would probably not be able to talk to people in Port Arthur, Texas, or Little Rock, Arkansas, or San Francisco, California. So they said in order to carry this message the best way we know how, we'll do it by this written word, and this book will become the knowledge and experience of how we 40 recovered from the disease of alcoholism, and it in turn should go and reach every alcoholic throughout the world. They told Bill Wilson that we want you to write the book. They said, you've been sober longer than any of the rest of us. And at that time, he had about 3 years sobriety. And they said, you're the one who started this thing, and you should write the book. But they said, this is not to be your book. It is to be the collective knowledge and experience and wisdom of all 40 of us. And it is to give the same 3 pieces of information that we have to know in order to recover. It is first to give the problem, then the solution, and then the practical program of action. And any alcoholic that knows those 3 things, that's willing to do the work necessary, will be able to recover from the disease. Joe and I have always said that if we ever found a reason to study the table of contents in the big book, that's where we would start. And we think now we know the reason. So if you will, let's open our books to the table of contents. You also have some handout sheets, and from time to time we're going to be putting a transparency up here on the screen which will match your handout sheet. Some of you may not be able to see the screen from where you're sitting, so your handout sheet will match it. And we'll start with the table of contents. Joe?
Okay, as we look at the table of contents, let's look also at, how do we solve problems? There are many, many problems in our world and in our personal lives. But the method of solving problems is very simple. The first step to solving a problem is, what is the problem? And this information has to be gathered. And the big book is going to work along the same lines of solving any problem. If your car stops in the street, the first thing you got to do is find out what is the problem. And we'll go to a doctor. The doctor will diagnose and find out what is the problem. So the first section of our book, The Doctor's Opinion and Bill's Story, is the section that shows us the exact nature of the problem. Now, once we have the problem, and we find out that the problem is the problem statement of step 1. The problem is we're powerless over alcohol, our lives have become unmanageable. So through the doctor's opinion, we learn the exact nature of our problem, and we can end up, as it says, that we are powerless. Now, once we have the problem, then it's from the first step. It's from the problem that we can determine the solution. You have to have the problem before you can see the solution. So the first step gives us the second step. Now, we learned from the first step that we have a physical allergy and a mental obsession. We can't do anything about the allergy. So the answer must lie within the mind. Therefore, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could work within the mind, could restore us to sanity. So once we see that the problem, then we can determine that the solution has to be in the mind, and so we will have that information, and there is a solution. More about alcoholism and we agnostics. These three chapters will deal with the solution to the problem. And we say that, we're powerless. Now, if you're powerless, obviously the solution is power. So the first step gives you the second step. Now, you might say that the first 2 steps are very precise. Number 1 shows the alcoholic exactly where he's at. Not where he thinks he's at, but where he's at. And once he sees where he's at, then the second step says, we believe you'd be better over here. So we establish 2 points, where we are and where we want to go. And this is the foundation for recovery.